Hello and welcome to our engineer interview with Steven McCarthy. My name is Scott and I'm your host for today. Before we start, I just want to say thank you very much for signing up to this year's competition. For those of you who don't know, this is the Leaders Award competition, where we ask the question, if you were an engineer, what would you do? Pupils from the ages of 3 to 19 anywhere in the UK can join, and every single pupil who takes part receives a named and graded certificate from a real-life engineer, just like the ones we interview. Now, during this series of interviews we're going to run throughout the year, we're going to be speaking with engineers who work on loads of different projects, all of them showing the wonderful, interesting and exciting things that happen when you work in engineering. Now, our special guest is going to start with a 10-minute presentation all about what it's like to be a marine engineer. And then that's going to be followed up with some questions from the audience. When we do get to the Q&A and you have a question, just pop it in the chat and we'll read it out to Steven. But for now, I'm going to pass over to our wonderful special guest for the presentation.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. And very good afternoon to everybody. You can see me, I can't see all of you. So if you do want to smile or give me a comment as we go, then do. But we've got about 20 minutes for questions. And hopefully, as we go through the next 10 minutes of presentations, there's lots of things that you'll be able to think of to ask me. My name's Steve. I'm a marine engineer, and I'm also in the Royal Navy. But primary engineer is about engineering. So the next 10 minutes is me telling you all about being a marine engineer and being a marine engineer in the largest employer of seafarers in the United Kingdom. The Ministry of Defence, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary is where most British seafarers are now currently out and plying our trade. I'm going to tell you what a marine engineer does. I'm going to give you a view of the jobs that I've done, so you can see the range of things I've done throughout my career in the Royal Navy. And then I'm going to have a little bit of reflection. I'm coming towards the end of my career in the Royal Navy, so when I say what do I want to do next, I've got to work out where my engineering journey is going to take me when I step ashore and put on a suit instead of a uniform. So there's a couple of ideas and reflections there. And then the last one that I think is always helpful for people looking back on their career is to think about some of the choices that I've made and whether or not the opportunities I had, I might have done something different with hindsight. And I can tell you that I love being a marine engineer, so there's not very much that I do differently, but maybe there's one or two ideas there for you about other choices that certainly I found quite attractive as I've gone through. So that's me. I'm the tall person in the white boiler suit with a hat on in the middle of the engine room of HMS Ocean. The first thing I think I'd like to give you an idea of is what an engineer, a marine engineer, does and why I wanted to be a marine engineer. I think the first thing of why is that ever since I can remember, I've always liked to know how things work. So this is a classic draw for us as engineers, how things worked. I always quite enjoyed taking things apart, putting them back together again. My parents were horrified when I got my first car, which was a Mini, and within 3 days, all of the engine was in piece parts on the garage floor, but it went back together and it worked afterwards. So I've always been really interested in how things work. And in fixing things. My granddad was a marine engineer, though. He was a chief engineer in the Merchant Navy. And he used to tell me some pretty good stories. And my favourite picture of him was wearing one of those white boiler suits on a paddle steamer up the Amazon River in about 1932. And he got up to some pretty amazing adventures. And I always found that quite inspiring, as well as fixing things, going around the world and having some adventures was something that I fancied doing. And I was in the cadets at school, so I was quite drawn to all of the things that you can do in the military. So the opportunities for sports and adventure and travel, and you can get those in the Merchant Navy and lots of different careers. But I always enjoyed the aspect of being in the Navy, in Navy cadets. I nearly joined the Army and went angry camping, but in the end, I knew that I really wanted to go to sea. Marine engineering. Why marine engineering? I think it's probably because we do a bit of everything. So I don't think there's an engineering discipline where we have to be so broad in all of our skills. So as well as propelling a ship through the water with the big main engines, the ship We need to generate all the electricity, so we've got an electrical power station. We have to feed and house up to 1,600 people in one of our aircraft carriers. So they need fresh water. I've got a sewage farm. They need a kitchen. They need ventilation. They need fridges to keep the food. We need weapons. I look after aeroplanes. We've got boats. So marine engineering, I think, is as broad as you can get in a career to have a go at all the sorts of different disciplines, from hydraulics to mechanics to electrics to electronics to controls. Everything's there. And you never get to be master of everything, but you certainly get to have a good go at it. And it's pretty big stuff as well. So I like big stuff. In HMS Ocean, you can see there's about 3,000 tons of fuel. There's about 40 million watts worth of power in the ship. So there's lots and lots and lots of things for us to do. But it's big. It's all big, and it's all big and exciting. So I think the next thing for me to do is just show you how I came through my career. So this gives you a view of our training and our formation. And then as you go through the different stages, the things that you get to do and how you can work both at sea. So that's a picture of my very first ship, which is a museum piece now. That's HMS Ariadne. She's a Leander-class frigate, had a steam engine, 2 big boilers. And I was on her as a trainee. And as a trainee, I got to clean a lot of things, as every trainee does. I got to get covered in oil very frequently, and I made quite a lot of tea. But I kind of learnt quite quickly about how all the systems worked through the ship, how they came together. And that was my sort of very basic formation of learning about how a ship was built, how the engines worked, where all the systems were. I went through my engineering training. The Royal Navy's got, or had at the time, its own university, the Royal Naval Engineering College. So I went off to the Royal Naval Engineering College and did my degree in marine engineering. And then I went back for my seagoing training. And I had 3 ships in the class that you see there, HMS Sheffield, HMS Brazen, and HMS Beaver. And that's where I got through all of my engineering qualifications. So I learned to be an engineer officer of the watch. I learned to operate all of the machinery that was in the ship. I learned to maintain lots of bits of equipment. I learned to operate the electrical generating machinery, set a power station on board. And that took me about the first 5 or 6 years of my career to get all of my qualifications, to then be qualified as a deputy marine engineer or a second engineer if you were in the merchant navy. So that was my first big engineering qualification, done at sea in 3 ships, great fun. And we went quite a long way around the world. We went across to America, the north coast of Africa, and I had 2 trips into the Mediterranean. So lots and lots of time at sea. Once I was qualified, I then went back to college very quickly for a quick course, and then I went back to sea as the deputy marine engineer officer, the second engineer of this ship. That's I was on board that ship when this photograph was taken. It's one of my favourites. We were dodging a submarine, spinning around the ocean, trying to make sure the submarine couldn't fire its torpedoes at us. And we were trying to get around so we could fire our torpedoes at the submarine. Imagine if this was a war game, not for real. So that's HMS Marlborough. She's a Type 23 frigate. She's got gas turbine engines and diesel propulsion systems. I was with her for 2 years. I joined her in dry dock. So as an engineer, we also do the refitting of the ships in dry dock, brought her out of dry dock and back into sea, and a couple of really interesting trips, again, across to America. There's a pattern here, into the Mediterranean, and then round to the Northern Arabian Gulf. So that's my second engineer's job. While I was on that ship, I also got my qualification to be a chief engineer. So I got to be a chief engineer by the time I was about 7.5 years into the Navy, and that chief engineer's ticket meant that I could be a chartered engineer. When I left HMS Marlborough, I went back to university. I went to University College London. I did a master's degree in marine engineering, and then I worked in a gas turbine project desk. before going back to sea in this ship. That's HMS Ocean. She's a helicopter and commando carrier, so that's the ship where you saw me in the engine room. And as well as being the chief engineer of HMS Ocean, I was also the chief engineer of 9 Assault Squadron Royal Marines. And if you have a look in the picture, you'll see some landing craft on what we call davits. So they're the cranes that lift the landing craft up and down through the water. And lots of other bits of amphibious assault equipment, including the best thing I've ever driven, which is a beach amphibious recovery vehicle. It's like a big sort of track tank. So when the Royal Marines get their landing craft stuck, you get to go and shove them back in the sea. So that was great fun. And again, we did 2 or 3 really interesting trips in HMS Ocean. So as you realise by now, I'm a kind of Mediterranean, North Africa, Gulf America specialist. But in Ocean, we also went up to the high north. So way north of the Arctic Circle in the winter, saw the Northern Lights every night for about 4 weeks in a row. So an absolutely amazing trip. After HMS Ocean, I went off and I did a bit more training. I went across to Canada on exchange with the Canadian Navy, where I was the project engineer for one of their surface combatants, so one of their frigate or destroyer warship classes. I was promoted to commander when I was in Canada, came back. There's a pattern here for marine engineers. I went back to sea. And this is the last ship that I sailed on properly, HMS Illustrious. She's an aircraft carrier. And in my history of repeating places that I've been before, this has taken about 120 miles north of the Arctic Circle on a cold winter exercise as we were flying Royal Marines ashore in helicopters to go and practice with our Dutch and Norwegian partners. So as a chief engineer in HMS Illustrious, just like HMS Marlborough, I joined her in Rosyth in Scotland, from close to where Scott lives, and dragged her through her refit, got her back into the water, through her sea trials, and then into operations and into her program. So that's the last ship I had. When I came ashore, I couldn't go back to sea. I'd done all the sea jobs I could, so I did the next best thing, and I got myself into sea training. In sea training, I was quite quickly promoted to being a captain, and as a captain, I joined our Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier project as the chief engineer. So I went from being chief engineer of 2 aircraft carriers to chief engineer of the build project for 2 aircraft carriers. So what I did next was take this on the left-hand side, that's HMS Queen Elizabeth in Rosyth being built, and I turned it into this, which is HMS Queen Elizabeth alongside in Norfolk, Virginia, USA, on flying trials for F-35 jets. And having done 1 aircraft carrier, there's only one thing better than 1 aircraft carrier. That's 2 aircraft carriers. And by the time I left the aircraft carrier project, 5 years later, we'd gone from 1 aircraft carrier in build to 2 aircraft carriers at sea, flying our F-35 jets that you can see on HMS Queen Elizabeth there. Got those ships into service with the Royal Navy. So that's something I'm really proud of, and something that will live with me forever. What I then did was went off on a training course again, and from being the chief engineer in charge of supporting our aircraft carriers and amphibious ships, I was then the head of naval ship support. So I was Commodore in charge of all Royal Navy and all Royal Fleet auxiliary ships. And now I'm the director of ship support. So I'm in charge of all Royal Navy and Royal Fleet auxiliary ships, all boats, capability integration and supply chain. So what I do now, from someone that got very oily and made a lot of tea, through 33 years in the Royal Navy, I'm now the director of all of it. And we spend about £1,200 million a year keeping our ships going. And in my team, there's about 1,100 people, plus all the people we work with in industry, to make this enormous endeavour and this enormous enterprise work. So what do I want to do next? That's me in a South Korean tank transporter in Malaysia. And that'll give you a clue that I'm doing some quite interesting things now. So I don't want to stop being the director for a little while yet. But this will be my last job in the Royal Navy. And as I reflect back, I think what I'd like to do is definitely keep working with ships and working with sailors. I've worked all throughout my year with some wonderful people, and I'd like to keep going. And I think I'd like to stay connected to the sea. So 95% of the trade in the United Kingdom, you might not know, but 95% of your data, your internet, your information comes under the sea. A vast majority of the energy that we use comes from the sea. So the sea and maritime has always been really, really important to the United Kingdom. And it's not going to get any less important in our future. If anything, it gets more important. So what I want to do next is probably stay being a sailor, because that's how much I've enjoyed it. And what would I do differently? It's a hard thing because I've enjoyed everything I've done. But I chose to take quite an academic pathway through my engineering career. So I went to university, I went back to university, and I did that so I could become a chartered engineer and a chief engineer as quickly as possible. If I did it again, now I know what I know, I might take a more vocational route. I think I'd be more confident not to need to rush through university, but maybe to spend a bit more time on the deck plates fixing things rather than rushing ourselves through university. But that said, I've enjoyed everything I've done, really, really enjoyed everything I've done. So I don't look back and think I've made a mistake, but I think I would encourage everyone to think about that vocational path rather than feeling like they have to take an academic path into engineering. Because many of my colleagues as captains took the vocational path. It might have taken them a little longer to get there, but we certainly all arrived at that destination, all of the same grade and all enjoying the same sort of responsibility. And there's not much else I do different. I've no regrets. I've enjoyed everything that I've done. And that's me. The picture you see there, if you remember at the start, there was a task group full of ships at sea. That's a picture from the park bench at the back of HMS Queen Elizabeth, looking out at all of the ships that are there to protect her and keep her safe on her mission. Scott, that's the end of my presentation, and I'd really like to see what questions we've got.
So, Stephen, what do you love most about your job?
So I think I love working with the people I work with most. Being in the Navy, being in a ship full of people, it's all about relationships and people. So I've always enjoyed working with a different, varied range of people. The Royal Navy's got someone from somewhere with loads of different skills and talents. It's a really interesting place to be, and we have a lot of fun.
And I did a question about, I hadn't really thought about how much you need to provide on a ship that size for all the people that are there. So it sounds like some of these bigger ships are almost like floating communities. So what is it like to be at sea for such a long time on a boat like that? Is it almost like living in a town?
So it is, yeah. So let me give you an idea of the sort of scale of ships. In the first sorts of ships I went to sea in, they were quite small, but they still had quite a few people on. So one of those frigates has about 200 people living in it. And you're like a big family. Everybody knows everybody, everyone gets along, but there's not a great deal of space on board. The big ships, HMS Queen Elizabeth, you can have up to 1,600 people on there. But it's a really big ship and there's a lot of space. So it doesn't feel like quite the same little family that you had in the frigate. But when you're at sea, then most people share their accommodation, so there'll be 3 or 4 people inside a cabin together. But you very quickly get used to being in and living with lots of other people. So I always characterize sailors as the most polite people you'll ever meet. Everyone's manners are impeccable. Everyone is very good at getting on with everyone else. Everyone keeps himself very clean and neat and tidy, puts everything away, because it doesn't take very much for it to get out of control. So I've always found it a great place to be.
Wow, we've got a question just about how much time you spent out there from Jess, and Jess asked, what was the longest you were at sea?
So the longest I've been at sea between port visits is about 2.5 months.
Wow, like almost 10 weeks just out in the open ocean.
Out on the open ocean, and then most of our deployments are about 6 or 7 months. So we might go away for 6 or 7 months. And normally you go on a port visit every month or 6 weeks or so. So you get into a port and you'll be able to refuel and get some fresh milk and do all those other things, and have a little run ashore, go and experience a different culture or a different country.
Well, yeah, just on that, there was a few questions about that. It sounds like you've really traveled basically all over the world. So what would you say of all the places you visited was your favorite?
Oh, that's a really, really hard question. So I've been fascinated by everywhere that I've been. My favorite place, very favorite place, was probably the high north of Norway in the winter. It was just so beautiful. We went up a fjord, a Norwegian fjord, in about an hour of daylight that we had a day. And there's something called sea smoke in the Arctic. So it's like a really, really thick fog, and it hangs just about 3 or 4 meters above the surface of the water. And all of the warships coming through the fjord were parting this fog as if it was water. It looked like a scene from a Viking movie. It's absolutely beautiful.
That is pretty. But yeah, you did mention that you saw the Northern Lights every night, so I did get a little bit jealous of that. But now even more. We've got a question coming in from Andrew at Sherfield School, and Andrew asks about when you're, and this might apply for when you were overseeing the build of a lot of the aircraft carriers. When in engineering, do you use or recommend any particular programs to help you design prototypes? I imagine there's quite a lot of testing to see what will work before we put it into a ship.
Yes, there is. So ships are interesting things. All the equipment that we put into the ship comes through a lot of testing. So even our new equipment, we might test quite extensively. And the Navy's got some big test facilities. If you're in Portsmouth and you look to the top of the hill, it looks like there's a warship that's been parked on the top of the mountain. But inside that warship is a big test facility where we do lots of integration testing. So we like to make sure that the equipment's going to work before we put it into the ship. The fascinating thing, I think, with marine engineering is that the first of the class of ships that you build is the prototype. So you're never 100% sure if it's all going to work together really well until you've taken it to sea and had a go. And there's lots, as you imagine, there's lots of programs you go through to make sure it's going to float the right way up. It's going to steer and turn around corners, and everything's going to work. The lights will stay on, but you never quite know until you get there. And as with all things engineering and scientific, the first time you do it is an experiment. You're going to learn a lot from that. You might have to change a few things. But by the time you get back and you build the next ship, hopefully you've found the things you need to fix and you fix them.
So we did have a question about what similar to that when you're sort of facing things that aren't working but you have to make them work. Roxanne asks, what's been your biggest engineering challenge and how did you overcome it?
Oh, great one. So I'm going to say this is a Norway story. I'm going to say in HMS Ocean, the design of the ship was actually one of those car carriers that you see. So if you have a look in the Solent, when you import and export cars, you get these big flat-sided ships that go in and out. HMS Ocean was one of those. The top car deck was taken off, the flight deck was put on with lifts and a hangar, but the basic design of the ship was a commercial ship. But what we didn't get were very good engineering drawings and instructions with the ship. We got quite a load of system drawings, but not a load of technical instructions. And in Norway, one of our engines stopped working that powered one of the propulsion shafts, and we couldn't restart it because the thing that stopped it working was a control system defect. So at night, in the middle of the night, my big challenge was to work out from the circuit diagram what and how to bypass the control system so that I could hand start the main engine to make the other propeller work so we could safely get out of the field. And we did it, but it took sort of every ounce of my engineering training to be able to understand from the circuit diagram how to diagnose the fault and how to make a repair and how to restore power to the ship's captain.
Wow, I can imagine that's quite tense on a massive ship in the middle of a fjord in Norway. So that was one of your biggest challenges. This question comes from Alaris, and Alaris asks, what's been one of your biggest achievements in your roles?
Oh, Alaris, that's a brilliant question. So for me, it's probably the aircraft carriers. So when HMS Queen Elizabeth went and did her first worldwide deployment in 2021. She went all the way out to Japan and around the Asia Pacific. That was the end of, for me, a 6-year project. So when I started in 2015 as the chief engineer of the project, we had a schedule that said HMS Queen Elizabeth was going to be in Japan in 2021. And no schedules go all according to plan. But over that 6 years, our team worked so hard to overcome all of these challenges of a first new warship coming in and training the crew and buying the spares. And we got HMS Queen Elizabeth on her deployment on time with her jets on the flight deck. And that, I think, is the thing I'm most proud of.
Yeah, that must have been seeing it leave and then also seeing where it goes must be quite proud moment to see not only we've built it, but it can actually go all over the world. We've got another question from Andrew and the pupils at Sherfield School. Andrew says, many pupils are fascinated with engineering in school. What subjects or courses are particularly beneficial to help you pursue a career in engineering?
Oh, another great question, Andrew. I think it's maths. And outside of maths, you can probably have a range of other things. So I would always say do a course you're interested in. So you don't have to be exclusively maths and physics and another one, but do something you're interested in because things are always easier when you're interested in them. You've got to be an engineer, you've got to do some maths. So whatever pathway you take through your training, there's always going to be maths involved. And then my choice, if you want to go through a more vocational route, do a higher national diploma as an access into higher engineering training, you can do that from school. So as long as you've got a GCSE maths and some GCSE science, and you're interested and you find it fun, then that's a pathway to succeed. I did maths and physics. In fact, I did maths, physics, and chemistry. Didn't do very well first time I did my A-levels, so I had to resit a couple of A-levels. Then I just did maths and physics and joined the Navy. We went through the engineering degree, and the engineering degree was mostly about maths and engineering maths. So physics is engineering maths, maths and physics is a pretty good foundation.
Brilliant. Well, that's one for the pupils there. We've got time for a couple more questions. So if you're sitting with any, please send them in. But this one comes from Caitlin. What made you choose to be in the Navy other than any other military branch? You mentioned you did flirt with the idea of the Army at one point.
Yeah. So I think it's mainly wanting to go to sea. So I was in cadets. I really did think about joining REME because I quite like the idea of mending tanks and running around. So basically, being outdoors, doing sports, doing exciting adventurous stuff is what I wanted to do, and I wanted to go to sea. So it's probably my granddad's stories from when he was growing up.
I can imagine.
But the idea of being in a ship and being in the middle of the ocean and being really self-reliant, because no one's coming out to mend you or fix you when you're 2,000 miles from anywhere. It's all up to you. That self-reliance, I think, is what really drew me to being in the Navy.
I had one question actually, because it sounds like from making tea to where you are now, there has really been opportunities for you to go up and progress throughout. Is that a common thing in engineering and specifically in marine engineering as well? This sort of, you can constantly go back and retrain and learn to do more.
It certainly is in marine engineering. So we've got a really good structured training pathway, and the Royal Navy's training pathway mirrors the Merchant Navy's training pathway. So our training is regulated by the same bodies as we go through. So if I was in the Royal Navy, the Merchant Navy, all those steps that I went through to be a chief engineer are all the same with all the same requirements in. I think the Royal Navy's given me an opportunity to do some more courses than I would have done if I was in the Merchant Navy. In the Merchant Navy, as a chief engineer, I would do sea time, then I'd come ashore and be a superintendent. But a superintendent kind of looks like what I was doing in HMS Queen Elizabeth, and then I might be a chief superintendent. So that progression, I think, in marine engineering is there. I don't know if it's similar in other disciplines of engineering. I've got a lot of friends who've gone into engineering and industry who seem to have spent longer in particular grades and jobs than you spend in grades and jobs in seafaring. But I think that's just because we've always got a through flow of people. Most people's seagoing careers are about 15 or 16 years, and then they go into superintending and other jobs. So we always need to pull people through.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've got time for one last question, and it's a quick one. For anybody out there thinking, I might look at being a marine engineer, what advice would you have for them?
So I think I would say, make sure that you understand all of the different sorts of marine and maritime engineering that you could do. So as well as working for the Ministry of Defence in the Royal Navy or the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, you could go and work offshore on an oil rig or the support shipping, or you could work in a cruise liner. There are lots of engineers in cruise liners. So there's lots and lots of different maritime engineering careers available that all require the same sorts of skills as a marine engineer. And it's quite hard to have a go, isn't it, to try. So I think the other thing about thinking about being a marine engineer is I think you've got to want to go to sea and be interested in ships in the sea. And if you're not interested in ships in the sea, going away from home might be just that bit more difficult.
Brilliant. Well, just look at the time. I'm going to bring this interview to a close. I want to say a massive thank you to Steven for sharing with us a little bit about what he's been through in his career, inspiring sort of the engineers in the making out there. Because all the people's watching this, it is your turn to come up with your own engineering ideas. Remember, you're answering the question, if you were an engineer, what would you be? And you can send in your submissions to us once they're ready, and then we'll be passing them on to get your certificates out to you. But for now, I want to say a massive thank you again to Steven, and thank you to everyone for watching us. Take care, everyone.